So we'll start the first panel, India, U.S., Global Uncertainty Shaping the Economy and Unearthing Opportunities. Our moderator is Vikram Chandra, founder of Editor G Technologies, who will serve as the moderator for the next session and who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for that. And it's absolutely a pleasure to be out here and to see all of you. We're going to leave this fairly free-flowing. We're going to try and have a candid discussion on the state of the economic part, in particular, the state of the world, and also the state of relations between the two countries. And I'm going to start off by keeping on the stage Mr. Sunil Munjal and Nikhil Sahni. I'm not going to introduce you again because everyone has already heard your introduction. But could I just invite Galina Hill onto the stage, please? There she is. So Galina is a professor of economics at the University of Santa Cruz. She's been also doing a lot of work in sustainability. So great to have you here with us, Galina. You've also written extensively. You're co-editor of, one second, let me just open this up. Problem with the computer, yeah. She's been also doing a lot of work in attracting mainstream finance to climate solutions, with sustainability being particularly important. Written more than 30 articles in leading economics and finance peer-reviewed journals, and is the co-editor-in-chief of the Review of World Economies. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us. Kenneth Letzer, thank you as well for being with us. He's a professor of economics at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Primary areas of research are international economics and macroeconomics. He's done a lot of work on international finance and has also been looking at the Indian economy particularly closely. He's a founder, member of the research panel for the India Policy Forum, which is a joint project of the NCAER and the Brookings Institute. He's also co-edited volumes on monetary policy for India. So thank you all so much for being with us. Before I get into how the two countries can work together and collaborate and celebrate both their similarities and differences, we are obviously dealing with a challenging period for the global economy. So I think if we could perhaps just spend 4 or 5 minutes understanding from you the nature of the international economy, how it is positioned right now, and what therefore are the choppy seas that we somehow have to try and navigate. Kenneth, would you like to start with that?
Already on. Okay. Well, first thing I guess I would start thinking about in terms of just the economy, focused on the economy, that tremendous amount of global uncertainty is induced by two things, right? One is the elections, various elections, political turmoil, both in the United States and elsewhere. I think that particularly affects trade uncertainty, uncertainty that affects international investment positions, international trade, as well as the decisions that have to be made in a country like India for trade, in particular in the trade of goods sectors. It also affects the consequences for India, right, in terms of income inequality and adjustment to the climate change. The other area would be monetary policy, largely in the world. We see what looks like a prolonged period of higher interest rates. We certainly have a good hint, clear hint from the Federal Reserve, clear hint from the ECB, and the BOE seems to be on board as well, that interest rates will be, for the long term, higher than they have been, raising the cost of public debt for not only the United States, but India's 84% of GDP debt.
Galina, if I can, would you like to add something to that? And specifically, of course, lots of challenges that have come, whether it's a war, whether it's inflation, which seems to be rising, higher interest rates, look as if they're going to be here for a while. So is it going to be a turbulent period? And if so, for how long?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of challenges, as you mentioned, that we're facing in the near term, medium term. I'm also concerned about their implication to the longer term challenges, and let me explain a little bit. So in an environment of higher interest rates, and I agree with Ken that they're going to persist for a while, and accumulated debt levels from the pandemic, we're facing very restricted government budgets. At the same time, we're facing challenges in meeting Paris climate goals, both in terms of mitigation, but I think more relevant for India in terms of adaptation spending. And it is very hard to push for new category of government expenditures in a situation where your debt levels are high and the interest rates are high, and they're going to remain high. And at the same time, economic growth is slowing down globally, which means you also want to stimulate the economy. So for the governments, I think the tasks are very difficult in deciding on prioritizing the near-term goals versus longer-term goals, and as also Ken said, facing a difficult political situation. I think in the majority of the countries, what we're observing in recent decade, I would say, is increasing polarization so that every election is decided by smaller and smaller margin, which means the governments then tend to prioritize nearer-term goals. So that makes me concerned about how we're going to deal with longer-term challenges. We can talk maybe a little bit later. I think India is actually in a good position to take a leadership and take advantage of some of those opportunities through innovation and private sector, and high level of technology and education that's arising in India, and collaboration between California, especially Silicon Valley, and India. I think there's a lot of potential there. But the uncertainties, I think, between the policy and what the governments can do are very real.
Well, some of the excess actually came from political reasons. Nobody wanted to take the pain. That's what drove interest rates down to zero and to below that. That's where all the spending came from. Why are we so certain that if there's going to be an election coming up next year here in the United States and in other economies, there won't be a sense of, well, let's get back to those good times and let's not have that political pain. Let's start spending. Who cares? Somebody else will worry about it 10 years later.
Yeah, well, so I'm hoping the central bank's independence is going to kind of keep us on track in terms of inflation level controls. I mean, inflation has been coming down. And by the way, we avoided when inflation first started rising, and economists would gather and discuss what should the Fed do really. There was quite a bit of concern of repeating 1982. And creating a global recession by raising interest rates really high. And you can argue whether it was the right thing to do in 1982. And I'm actually glad to see that the extent of global recession we saw in 1982 did not materialize. And so there are many reasons for that. But I have a lot of faith in central banks. And hopefully they can see through the political cycles.
Before I come to Sunil and Nikhil, you were smiling. Kenneth, do you share that faith in central banks?
Well, I think that going beyond that, right, is that the question really was about fiscal policy, right, and the kinds of constraints on fiscal policy. I think I go think a little bit further, in if you're thinking about the impact of the United States, for example, on India and other countries, other emerging markets, really the rest of the world, it would be, of course, the prospect of going back to a administration that was very profligate. That would be one of the threats, and also very protectionist. So that's really a severe problem for the world. And as Galina said, that kind of polarization is widespread. We haven't seen that kind of polarization in Europe since World War II, which is really impressive.
Sunil Manchal, India is being spoken increasingly about the bright spot in all of this. I mean, there are a couple of other bright spots, but India clearly being spoken about as one of the bright spots. What could be the challenges that will come to India from some of these factors that are being spoken about? I mean, high oil prices obviously would affect India. High interest rates elsewhere could affect India. What do you think the risks are to the India growth story in all of this?
I'm going to expand my answer beyond your question, if you don't mind. I'm going to cover part
Feel
of
free.
what they would.
This is supposed to be free-flowing.
Yeah. So India, you're right. India right now is like an island. It's 6 to 6.5% growth. Any country would give their left and right arm for anywhere close to that. We crib in India, but when we look outside, you kind of get consoled that we're actually doing pretty well. So, and also it's become, India has now either got invited to or close to the top table in geopolitics. it's also willing to make big, bold moves. The big global solar alliance, the big security alliance, the big India, Middle East, Europe transit connection. So India is playing an interesting role right now, which rolls back into some of the benefit that comes to India from globalization. I want to talk a little bit about globalization, if you don't mind. 70 to 80 years, and this is also part of the reasons of what both of you were speaking about, why this is happening and why for political leaders it's a hard one to change. For 70 to 80 years, we followed this market economy model very efficiently, very productively. The entire world has gained from it, especially countries like India gained tremendously. But what it did do was created this gap between the top and the bottom, a yawning gap, which it just started showing the differential to the ones left at the bottom because of communication, internet, media. They can see how the top end has benefited, and it's not made people happy. And politicians are very, very smart. They react and respond very quickly to this. And this number actually grew quite significantly across the globe, including in big economies like the US. So a politician now responding to this has either turned extreme left or extreme right. And by the way, this is true. You go across the globe and you will see this, country after country after country. And which is also why it's very hard for them to take some of the decisions which are economically sensible otherwise, because they're not politically sensible from their point of view. They don't get votes. So there is a conflict right now in policy that will get you votes and policy that's sensible and good to do. So we are actually at a very complex place in the world, and the pullback from geopolitics is also part of the fallout. So it's my country first, my jobs first, my people first. So the benefit that was flowing out of the global supply chains is either getting broken or is having to be rebuilt. Now, if we are smart as India, we should play a key role in this. And we have started to position ourselves, at least in manufactured goods. In services, we already played an important role. In manufacturing, we are putting ourselves in the position where India becomes an important and an integral part of the global value chain. If we do that well, we stand to gain despite high prices, both on oil and interest rates.
Nikhil, just looking at the situation in India, 6 to 7% growth is there right now. And I think the good news in many ways is that it's actually been fairly secular. That growth rate has been there right from 1991 onwards. In fact, you could argue from even a little before that. Now it's starting to be seen on the ground, because when you're a $3.7 trillion economy and you grow at 6 to 7%, you're adding that much more to the economy every single year. So it's more visible, but that growth has been there. And that growth has been therefore there across political parties, right? Whether it was the NDA or the UPA or United Front, that growth was happening. How sustainable do you think this particular growth rate is for the next 5 years or 10 years or 15 years? Because that might well be writing a lot of at least the future of the planet may well depend on that question.
You're very right. I think that's where the sense of confidence of India playing a role in the global economic order really does play out. And it's based on a variety of different facts. This is the first time in living history that India has had a lower inflation rate than the EU, the US, the UK. And this manifests itself in terms of lower cost of capital, in terms of executing projects which India needs. India needs to attract capital, and India needs to deploy capital. But at the same time, you have a demographic change which is happening. The percentage of people who are going to be in the working age in India, which is between the age of 18 and 65, will reach approximately 68% of the population by about 2030, which, where compared with China, it had about 75% of the working age in 2004. It gives you an idea about the productive capacity of the economy. When you talk about the growth rate, not only you will have consumption-led growth in India, but you'll also have fixed capital-led formation. We can't compare with China, but the sustainability of that growth of approximately 6.5 to 7% would mean that between 2023 to, say, 2030, you would have an economy in India which would grow from about 3.7 trillion to about 7.5 trillion to 8 trillion. That additional $4 trillion of GDP it would be the exact amount that the entire European Union would be adding in terms of additional capacity of economic output. And so it's important to recognize the role that India will play in the global context. It's going to be different from the way that China grew, in my opinion, because while you have a more confident India right now, from an individual perspective as well as corporations, the size and scale, as you pointed out, really does matter more. The research and development that is happening now is happening with a more confident individual, which believes that their technology will play a role in global supply chains and global businesses. Just to digress a little bit on the point that Mr. Manjal made about the disparity of income, I think the way that I like to look at India is 3 Indias. You have, on a PPP basis, you have a UK with maybe about 60 million people who have a PPP per capita income of about $45,000 per capita. You have approximately 350 million people who are East Asian, Indonesia, Thailand, which have a per capita income of approximately $10,000 a year. And then you'd have about 900 million people who are on a PPP of sub-Saharan Africa. And we have to build systems that recognize the disparities, help bridge that so that we don't get caught in the political mess of populism, which I have to say is of a greater risk in the West than it is in India.
So the potential secular growth is not 5 years, it's 25 years for India. You will, of course, see some blips along the way, as you will in any economy. But this kind of feeds on itself. The beauty of India is 2 parts. The top end of the Indian consumer is global. They're no different from a consumer in LA or in Las Vegas or in Paris or New York. The bottom end today is not consuming, by the way. As that economy is growing, and it is growing, you will create the largest growth market in the world at a completely different price line, but it will be the largest growth market in the world. It's bigger than US, it's bigger than Europe, actually it's bigger than both of them combined. But the interesting one today is what we call Middle India. Middle India is very aspirational. It is the fastest growing middle class in the world today. They want better education for their kids. They want better healthcare. They want better goods to consume, better services available. And they are seeing the availability of it in little bits and pieces. As they get more, they get hungry for more. And so it's kind of feeding on itself. So I think we are in good shape. Unless we trip on something external, which does happen. Nobody anticipated Russia and Ukraine and the impact it would have on the rest of the world.
It could be external, it could be internal. We'll have to see what exactly potentially does it. Let me just start getting in the theme of collaboration, because that's what this conference is about, US-India collaboration and partnership, and how the 2 countries can work together on some of this. And let me start perhaps by bringing in, well, not the elephant in the room, but the dragon in the room, which is, to what extent, in your view, is all the talk of collaboration and cooperation and partnership, whether it's at the government level or at the strategic level or company-to-company level also, to what extent, Kenneth, do you think this is being driven by the China factor, that for both the US and India and other countries, there's an imperative to try and find a way out of the entire dependence that the global economy seems to have built up on China over a period of time? And that's a bet which may not have worked all that well.
Okay, well, I'll start with it. I think everyone else will pick up on it. One of the things that India would look forward to, right, is competing with China. And one of the places where, think about India as maybe being laggard, also thinking about distribution and growth in the future and reaping any dividends from the demographic bubble, right? Each of those, I think, really have to do with, a lot of it has to do with the low productivity and low skilled industries. That's been laggard, and that's something to really pay some attention to. I think that's national, but it intersects with international trade, right? But it's one of the places where India has not done particularly well. India has a tremendous amount of growth in some industries. There's small transport in particular, for example. Apparel is another one. But less so much less so in agriculture, other than rice exports. And you see sort of those kinds of things that would be returns to the poor, and where there might be returns to well, not so much access as quality of education for that half of the population. That is for urban and rural. I think that's really important. And so cooperation, I think, is largely at a policy level, right? And at an investment level. Access to investment. One of the things that's really important in India is easing credit constraints for firms. A lot of that easing of credit constraints has actually come from foreign capital.
But do you think in the US also there is that imperative to try and diversify away from China in this areas like supply chain? And is that playing a major factor in this?
It's really hard to say about India. I mean, it's sort of thinking about India's ability to engage in global value chains, right? Increasingly important in international trade, has been somewhat limited, right? They had an opportunity with the U.S. tariffs on China, Chinese tariffs on the United States, and there wasn't any increase in exports, no notable increase in exports to the United States. That was offset by the tariffs imposed on India, partly, and the and of course the elimination of GSP for India, the preferences. One of the ways of sort of looking at that then is, did India take advantage of an exports into China? And there's none of that. So I don't think China represents a very strong market for India except in intermediate goods in the future. But again, having not taken advantage of that. The net result of the trade war was, in fact, that India expanded its exports to the rest of the world, not to China and the US. And that huge expansion into the US came from countries like Vietnam and Mexico. So there's a lot to go on how do firms find their way into the global value chains. And one of the just information at the firm level, ways of providing that information, cooperation with foreign firms, right? I think a lot of that might be in the private sector. Finding out in particular, right, how, what does somebody want? What quality of product do you want? That's incredibly important. And it's also the thing that I sort of think of, just comes to my mind first about entering global value chains, right, getting into trade, is being able to participate in relational contracts where contracts are not well enforceable and they really rely on reputations and earned reputations and connections, and that kind of networking is really important. And I think India has probably fallen behind to that, certainly compared to Southeast Asia.
Irina, I guess also interests and relations can sometimes change. There was to be a time on sustainability, for example, or climate change. India's position was probably much closer to China's than it was to America's. And then it starts to change where China suddenly becomes a very big emitter and you're arguing about other things. How do you see that dynamic playing itself?
Yeah, thanks for this very good question. So I think there are a few things that India has done really well in terms of collaboration, and I think, pharmaceutical industry could be one example, right? So taking the innovation that happens here and the rest of the US and Europe and producing for the mass market. There are other industries where that can potentially be done. And, China has done this with solar panels and e-bikes, and now the world is flooded with cheap solar panels and e-bikes, which I think is a good thing. And so India can find its own niche. I think a rising industry here in the Silicon Valley is alternative protein industry, which has a potential to address also food security issues in Africa and India, in places where a lot of crops are weather dependent. So maybe some, I'm particularly excited about mycoprotein. You can grow protein in a vat, and it's kind of like a factory you can put in any town, and it's just the fungi growing on some cycle, and it does not depend on yields and weather and things like that. So I think going forward, it's really important. So that's one industry where China actually is looking very closely into. Their agriculture university has done a study on this, of how it's going to affect Chinese growing food needs in an environment where we have a growing uncertainty about crop yields. And so that's where India also has potential to enter. So I think that's where things have gone well. I think other opportunities are, as Ken said, attracting foreign capital. It's not just the money that's useful. Money, of course, is useful. But there is a whole bunch of literature shows that positive productivity spillovers are following the money. They're following foreign direct investment. And again, something could be learned from China experience. They have intentionally attracted foreign direct investment, and that spilled over into labor productivity, innovation, and export quality in China. I wrote a book about that like 20 years ago. And so I think that's something that India can go and it can contribute to productivity growth in the industries that potentially are now lagging. Another thing to think about is kind of where is India heading in terms of industrial composition and export composition? Obviously, as a large economy, as you were talking about, India can kind of be a closed economy because there is domestic demand and India can pretty much produce everything. But in terms of exports, as economies develop, they tend to move up the profitability chain, if you will. So the less developed economies export goods that are lower profit margins. And we've seen that again with Singapore is kind of a poster child of this, and then China kind of went through that. And then production in this lower margin goods moves elsewhere. And so this is kind of a cycle. And I think for India to have maybe some intentionality on supporting the industries have a higher potential for technological spillovers for domestic consumption as well as for moving up to higher profit margins. Because what's happening now, the collaboration, I think, is nice, but it's not very even in the sense that a lot of profit is extracted by foreign-owned companies, right, through outsourcing, offshoring. And again, once the goods go off patents, that's when India steps in. But once the goods go off patents, the profits drop. So thinking about how to maintain that profit margin that would allow domestic capital to accumulate and reduce reliance on foreign capital as well.
Sunil, you may well have a situation, if you look at virtually any projection, starting 2028 onwards, India, China, maybe in the other order, India, China, the USA, the three largest economies. So how do two of them work together? If you had to make a strategic blueprint for how India and the US could work together on the economic front, what would that blueprint look like to you?
First, I want to reiterate the point you were just making, that India can learn from China experience. We don't need to compete with everything head-to-head with China. Frankly, there's no need. There's enough room for both, and there's enough room for both to grow. And India and the US offer an interesting possible set of possibilities of partnerships where both end up benefiting from it. I was mentioning a little bit earlier, one of the things India has recognized is the need to train and skill people who are going to go out of the country in any case. So there are a number of new opportunities which were never considered opportunities earlier in India. The advent of the electronic hardware industry, if the 2 or 3 fab facilities India is talking about come up in the next few years, the single largest manufacturing industry in the world is the electronic hardware industry. And India is increasingly not just a large consumer, it can be a large producer and a supplier to the world as well. At this moment, a lot of the work we are doing is actually assembling. We make phones, but a lot of the what goes in is actually coming from overseas. So the opportunity is pretty immense. So which is why I'm not negative about some of the problems. By the way, the problems you mentioned are real, but within them is the opportunity for us to take benefit of. And it is no doubt the government today, the Indian industry today is a little bit more both aggressive and forward-looking on taking advantage of the situation globally. And where India sits right now. US recognizing India's position in Russia and this war with Ukraine was a case in point. It recognizes we don't like this, but we accept it. Okay, let's still continue to work in other areas. I think this is going to be a two-way street, which allows both sides to, as I said, not just focus on the commonalities, but also accept differences and despite that continue to grow.
Nikhil, if you had to sketch out a blueprint?
to understand, I principally believe with what was said earlier that we're entering into a phase of higher interest rates globally, which is sort of the environment that India has lived in for a while. And I think the value addition that India will provide on the global stage from research and development, primarily led by a diaspora, which is increasingly looking to contribute back, but also a talent pool which is increasingly looking to stay back in India, will lead to IP development, which will be global in scale and global in outlook. And I think that India will play a greater role in that. It's going to be small to begin with, but increasingly over the next 20 years, it will play a much more significant role. When we look at areas of collaboration and shared interests on the geopolitical side, and with China, which you brought up earlier, defense comes to mind. But defense is really not the largest fixed capital spend between both countries. But in terms of, there still exists gaps, even though we may consider ourselves to be trusted partners. I know that India is not part of AUKUS, which is the nuclear submarine program, which has a different level of understanding between the United States, Australia, and the UK, where maritime security is one of the primary concerns that India has in the Indian Ocean versus a more aggressive and expansionist China. And when we combine that with the economic trade deficit that we have with China, it is a direct concern in terms of how we view our neighbor. The US shares it in a different context in terms of great power rivalry. And I think that convergence, we share a view on where China should be in our respective economies. From a perspective of trade flows, we are dependent. There's no way we depend on China equally as much as the US depends on China from a supply chain perspective. But increasingly, I would believe that there would be a recognition from consumers to move away as well slightly. And over a period of time, China will become more expensive as a supply chain base. Collaboration, I think, on the healthcare side is one of the areas which has immediate and potentially very large direct impact to citizens. India currently has approximately 1% of its GDP spent on healthcare, while the US may have about 20%. That may be too high. But areas for development of newer ways and systems of delivering healthcare in a form where India enjoys a comparative advantage, which is through digital means, I think can create new ecosystems of how to address challenges at a cost point which India can afford and which the US needs. So I think that we're coming into an area of...
You can actually extend that to multiple other areas. Is the technological development which has taken place in US and continues to take place, and the ability of India to translate this into low-cost solutions, much lower-cost solutions to address, again, a large audience. To the point Ken made earlier, I think impact investment, the interesting thing was 95% of funds for impact investments in India were coming from overseas, a large portion of it coming from the US. That has changed in the last 3 years itself. India is now making up about 30% of that from 5%, and it's growing. So as you start addressing the bottom of the pyramid, you have to be innovative in your solutions, and that does need presence on the ground. US cannot do it by itself. So the combination of Indian and US ideas and implementation coming together offers enormous opportunities. Again, the obvious ones, and defense, by the way, is a large industry. You can't write it off as not a large industry. It's a huge industry.
No, it is a large industry, but the fact is that collaboration will happen more from IP perspective rather than trade. I think India has a very concerted strategy towards building India for India, and at the price point of India.
Yeah,
Sure.
I just want to add one more thing. So I want to go back to some of the discussion of education that was mentioned in the first panel. And I think that's another opportunity for collaboration for our two countries. And I think, there is a very high potential, again, people going back to India, people receiving education here going back to India, including academics able to teach in Indian universities. And I think the type of collaboration also needs to evolve to more equal collaboration as opposed to, US universities are teaching Indian students. It's not the best kind of model. The best model is when there is a two-way collaboration in terms of teaching as well as in terms of research, because I think the intellectual potential, the human capital potential in India is enormous. The fact that we speak the same language is an extremely, good. It's very helpful. Is very helpful, and I think we see some of that, but I don't think we are exploiting this opportunity to its fullest at the moment.
Nikhil, you were trying to say something?
No, sorry?
Carry on, Nikhil.
No, I think that from a perspective of education, there exists enormous possibility of leveraging the connect that the countries have from a people-to-people basis, and I think that you're already seeing that be delivered on the ground. I'll come back.
Right. Just to take this point forward to
Just
that.
just a quick point about education is thinking about where the big impact of education is that cooperation, right, as Galina was saying, in education is extremely possible, and particularly focuses on technological innovation, that kind of education for what are at least that middle. But I would think that there's a lot to be said about, as raised in the first panel, is that the wealth distribution, income distribution is something to be really aware of. And I think for people in the point at the elite, that is in the industries, not just in government, but particularly, and maybe even more so in the private sector to be fully aware of, is that education really is lagging for that half of the population. And a large part of that lag actually has to do with incentives for just showing up, absenteeism, things like that. So I think that some of that focus, there may be areas of cooperation that go more broadly into innovations in education.
Just wanted to talk about that. Now, if you got two countries separated by as much distance as India and the US had, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, you would have said, how is it even possible for them to collaborate that much? Like for teaching, having to go back and teach as opposed to teaching from here. But it's a different world today, right? And after the pandemic, it's even more different. You could be teaching at a university in India via Zoom from here, and vice versa. You could have that constant interaction. And it certainly helps if I look in the room around us, and if you look at, we've been doing tours of all the top places in Silicon Valley, the number of Indians they are there, the number of Indian CEOs they are there, those connections are there. So it's not that difficult to do the connections now in the virtual world. In fact, that distance could almost be an advantage, because in research, for example, it can become a 24-hour research cycle where the two teams are actually working together. So do you think that the problem of distance may soon start to disappear, and as a result, cooperation can be put on an exponential track?
100%.
I'm thinking, yeah,
okay. Our former student, Anirban Sanyal, is now working at the Reserve Bank of India. We're working on a couple of projects together. It's very efficient. I'm doing my part, and he wakes up and does his part. I mean, and it's never an issue of, setting up a meeting. I've given multiple webinars for Indian audiences, and, we had here in UCSC at the Caffeine Center, we had Indian speakers for our webinar. And I think it's already happening. I think that's not a potential. It's just a matter of exploring that. Yeah.
Sunil, you agree with that? Actually, that problem of distance could start disappearing as we become more and more virtual, and as more and more it becomes digital technologies and digital innovation, or digital infrastructure for that matter, and those become the defining and important aspects of the global economy. You can do it. You can collaborate much more closely than you could ever do in the past.
Actually, INSEAD showed that to us many, many years ago, by the way, by setting up a campus in Singapore and teaching classes together. We tried this in ISB. In our university, we do this. We have lectures taking place in the US, teaching our classes, and also in other countries. We also have academics from these countries visiting India to teach classes physically now. Both things are happening. And some of them actually happy to come back. We have some faculty with us from MIT, from Imperial, from Oxford, from a whole bunch of places actually, who've come back and are living on campus and teaching there. So I think this is an increasingly growing tribe who also want to be experimental. They also want to learn. It's an amazing learning. It's not just one way. For students here to be sitting in the US and only being exposed to US is not enough. The world is not only the US.
But
They have to go out because in this changing world, it's important to understand how things are in Eastern Europe, how it is in Asia, how it is in India. I think it'll be a fantastic opportunity to grow this.
I don't think distance is as much of a problem as it was in this digital world and a highly aspirational Indian polity. You have the MTV effect. Everyone looks to the US from an aspirational perspective, from a lifestyle perspective. They don't really look at Russia from a lifestyle perspective. So you do have Indians who understand the US very, very well. Does it work the other way around? I don't think so. They could
There's
be.
yoga, there's food,
Well, I mean, but that's that. I think yoga may be
Bollywood.
to 5% of the population. I mean, it
Look at the number of CEOs of Indian origin out here. Now, cricket, they're watching cricket. The CEO of Microsoft like watches cricket before he watches anything else.
Yeah, we may be missing a match right now. I don't know. But,
No, we timed this very well. There's no
but
cricket match.
I think one thing that we missed out, as was pointed out initially, in this world of uncertainty and the transitions that we're going through, the biggest one is climate. And I think that it's very important to recognize that we have to collaborate on that. We face different problems. We need different adaptation strategies for India. India needs to increase its per capita energy consumption. And that has to happen in a sustainable manner. We can't do it the way China did it. We can't be setting up coal-fired power plants. But at the same time, we need to address our genuine energy needs. How do we do that? We need science and technology, but more than anything else, we need capital. And we need to do it in a much more sustainable manner. And I think we're trying to approach it that way. And we have to have open and frank dialogue. There will be areas that we disagree. There will be areas where we're both competing for the same resources. But I think that if we open it, if we have the dialogue with trust, which I don't think existed with the dialogue between China and the US, you could make meaningful change. And I think India needs to prove a new form of development, because otherwise Africa will not be able to succeed. So the world needs India to succeed, actually.
You want to add something on that, on sustainability? Galina, if I can ask you. On sustainability?
Oh, 100% true. And I think that's where it's crucial that US students and researchers go to India and spend some time there, because you cannot come up with solutions without a local context. Especially
Zoom is not enough for this.
Zoom is not enough. You need to see the cultural constraints. You need to have feet on the ground. You need to meet people. You need to develop these relationships. And so I think Zoom is great because it facilitates certain stages of collaboration. But absolutely, we need to have American students spending a year abroad in India so that they have an understanding of the challenges that India is facing and get interested in solving India problems, because they're not the same as US problems in terms of climate adaptation.
All right, I think we're approaching the end of time. So
Chancellor Larvi, I think you may want to have a Bollywood.
By the way, she's ahead of the curve. At lunch, she asked me, how can we get more students into internships in India? So she's genuinely thinking ahead.
Kenneth, last words from you.
Well, I think I'll take a different tact, which is a more global level. One of the things that we've seen with dealing with climate change is an inability of countries to cooperate with one another. And one of those proposals that's out there, it's been out there for a long time actually, which is climate clubs, which is the idea that some countries can cooperate together. I think that if we thought about countries you'd like to see cooperating together, of course, China and North America and Europe would be wonderful. India is absolutely essential to that, and now being the largest economy is going to be one of the largest carbon-producing economies, along with the United States and China. It already is. And I think that's an important opportunity for the United States, and that can start at a level of a university, and universities that start at the level of that as we grow towards the kinds of things that are more formalized and larger.
Sunil, if I can get you to just sort of wrap up this session for us, because obviously, as we began by saying, the situation in India also needs to be communicated to some extent. Some of the things that used to be viewed as the big problem out there in India, like infrastructure. Oh, there'll be no power and there are no roads, and what happens if the electricity goes off, and what about logistics? Those have almost dramatically stopped being problems. In fact, in areas like digital infrastructure, India is ahead of the curve, one of the best in the world. So as that changes, then other problems sometimes come up. What would be your final thoughts on that? The problems and the solutions going forward and how we can collaborate.
So first, we have to recognize the problems are real. A number of them are real. Some of them are fixable by policy. Some of them purely by attitude. And some by learning new techniques, technologies, methods, and process. And also, I think there is a little bit of work still required to be done to improve work ethic in some places. But like I said at the start, overall, I'm very optimistic about the direction we're in. And the good thing is we've started looking at our problems also as opportunities. Because earlier we would always try and hide them, that this is not a problem. So we would argue that it's not really a problem, that you guys from outside are telling us it is. But today we actually embrace this and we're saying, oh, great, let's go and fix this. So here's an opportunity to do something better. And all the stuff you said at the start, Ken, are real. And the good thing is you go in now, you find companies, you find institutions, you find states of India saying, let's go and address this. And some of them have. It's not across the board. It's not rampant as one would like to see it, but it has begun. So I'm very optimistic about both the path we are on. I hope and wish some of these things could move even faster. But considering the extreme diversity we have in India, we are bigger than any continent. We are a civilization. So I think we do need a little bit of patience to address the vast difference in the way the demographics is, the population is. Which other continent had 5,000 dialects spoken across the continent? There isn't one. So we do need to recognize some of these things about India. We like to believe we are unique in everything. We are not. But there are some things in which we are distinctly different. So the need to address these problems also therefore needs to get customized to our own unique situation.
All right. I think we just reached the end of time. Ticked over to 4:30, so thank you all so much.